The church was silent except for the sound of weeping and the sharp, cutting voice of a man who had already decided who belonged and who didn't. "Get her out," Marcus Hargrove said through gritted teeth, pointing across the marble floor of his father's funeral chapel. His finger was aimed directly at a woman standing quietly near the back, a woman in a plain black dress, clutching a small, worn envelope to her chest, tears streaming silently down her face. She didn't fight back. She didn't say a word. She simply lowered her head and turned toward the door, the way a person does when they've been turned away so many times that the humiliation no longer surprises them. She walked out into the gray morning light and sat alone on the chapel steps. But 40 minutes later, the priest cleared his throat at the pulpit, unfolded a document sealed with red wax, and began to read the last will and testament of Mr. Theodore Hargrove. And the name that came first was not Marcus. It was not any Hargrove at all. It was hers. But how did a quiet, overlooked waitress end up as the legal wife of one of the wealthiest men in the city? Let's go back to the beginning. Her name was Diane Osei, and she had been waking up at 4:30 in the morning for the better part of 11 years. Not because she wanted to, but because the number 6 bus ran at 5:15, and if she missed it, she'd have to wait 40 minutes for the next one. And if she missed that, she'd be late to the Hargrove Grand Hotel, where she'd worked as a breakfast waitress since she was 26 years old. She had built her life on the edges of other people's mornings, refilling coffee before it was asked for, remembering that table 9 didn't like pepper, smiling even when her feet ached so badly she could barely feel them by noon. Diane was not invisible because she was unremarkable. She was invisible because people had decided not to look. She was the kind of woman who pressed her uniform the night before, who kept a small photo of her late mother tucked into the pocket of her apron, who hummed quietly while she restocked the sugar caddies. She sent money home to her younger sister in Ghana every month. Not much, but whatever she could spare. She had dreams that she tucked away carefully, like folded letters you never send, because the rent was always due, and dreaming felt like a luxury she hadn't earned yet. It was at this hotel, on a cold Tuesday morning in November 3 years earlier, that she had first brought coffee to table 4. Theodore Hargrove was a man who had once commanded boardrooms and built his fortune in commercial real estate across 4 states. But on that November morning, he looked like a man who had forgotten why he'd gotten out of bed. He was 71 years old, recently widowed, and sitting alone at the window table with a newspaper he hadn't opened. His hands, once so sure and deliberate, were wrapped around an empty mug he hadn't thought to refill himself. Diane noticed. She always noticed. She came over quietly, poured the coffee without being asked, and said nothing. Just a small nijamahni, warm and unhurried. Theodore looked up at her with an expression that she would later describe as startled, the way a man looks when he realizes someone has actually seen him. That was where it began, not with grandeur, not with declarations, just coffee and kindness, and a Tuesday morning neither of them would ever forget. Over the following months, Theodore came to the Hadwell dining room every Tuesday and Thursday. Not because the food was exceptional, though Diane would argue the eggs Benedict were underrated, but because something about that table, that window, and that particular waitress made the grief in his chest feel a little more breathable. They talked, slowly at first, in the way 2 people do when they're both afraid of needing something. He would ask about her sister. She would ask whether he'd managed to eat a proper dinner the night before. He began leaving books on the corner of the table when he left. Novels, memoirs, a worn copy of James Baldwin that she stayed up 2 nights to finish. She left him handwritten notes tucked beneath the bill. Not love letters, not yet, just small observations. Something funny that had happened on the bus. A quote she'd come across that seemed written just for him. Marcus Hargrove knew nothing about any of this. Marcus was Theodore's only son from his first marriage, a man of 44 who had inherited his father's sharp jaw but not his patience or his warmth. He ran the East Coast division of Hargrove Properties from a glass office in Midtown, and he spoke about his father's legacy the way men speak about money they're waiting to receive, with impatience dressed up as respect. He visited his father 3 or 4 times a year. He called less often than that. He had no idea that his father had stopped being lonely. But here is where you need to pay attention. Because what Marcus didn't know was already changing everything. 18 months after that first Tuesday morning, Theodore Hargrove asked Diane Osei to marry him. Not in a restaurant, not with a performance. He asked her on a bench in Riverside Park on a Sunday afternoon in April, when the cherry trees were just beginning to blur pink at their edges, and she was reading aloud to him from the Baldwin novel because his eyes had grown tired. He simply reached into his coat pocket, placed a gold ring in her palm and said, "I don't want to waste the time I have left not being married to you." She said yes. She said it quietly, the way she said most things, but her hands were shaking. They married 3 weeks later at a small civil ceremony. Just Diane, Theodore, and 2 witnesses. A neighbor of Theodore's named Ruth and Diane's co-worker, a woman named Sandra who cried through the entire thing. There was no announcement. Theodore had wanted to tell Marcus in person, had drafted the conversation in his head more than once. But Marcus was always traveling, always unavailable, always somewhere that wasn't here. And then Theodore's health began to decline. It happened faster than either of them had expected. The diagnosis had come quietly. A word from a doctor in a beige office that rearranged the future like furniture shoved against a wall. Theodore had 6 months, maybe 8. Diane did not leave his side. She reduced her hours at the hotel, then stopped going altogether. She learned to manage his medications, sat with him through the long hospital afternoons, held his hand during the nights when pain made sleep impossible. She became his world, and he hers, in the compressed and luminous way that only people who know time is short truly understand how to love. She never asked about money, not once. She never asked about the will, or the estate, or what would happen after. When Theodore brought it up, she would change the subject, pressing her lips to his forehead and telling him they had enough time left to worry about that later. But Theodore was a man who had spent his life making sure the people he loved were protected. He was not going to leave this world without taking care of her. And still, Marcus did not know she existed. When Theodore passed on a Wednesday evening in March, it was Diane who was holding his hand. It was Diane who called the hospital. It was Diane who sat in the waiting room of the funeral home the next morning, red-eyed and hollowed out, making arrangements with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had promised her husband that she would handle things. It was also Diane who did not know that Marcus had already been called by a distant cousin, and that Marcus had already started making his own arrangements. When Diane arrived at the funeral chapel on the morning of the service, she was not prepared for what she found. She had dressed carefully. The black dress she had bought when her mother died, the gold ring Theodore had placed on her finger, the small worn envelope that held a letter he had written her 6 weeks before he passed. She had planned to sit quietly in the front row as his wife and say goodbye to the man who had changed her life. She never made it past the entrance hall. Marcus saw her the moment she walked through the door. He did not know her name. He had never been told it. But he looked at her, at the simple dress, at the modest shoes, at the face that was unmistakably not from his world. And he made a decision in under 3 seconds. "Excuse me," he said, stepping towards her with the practiced authority of a man who had never been told no. "This is a private service. Staff are not welcome here." Diane looked at him. Something moved across her face, not anger, not yet. Something closer to exhaustion. The exhaustion of a person who has been mistaken for less than they are so many times that the mistake barely registers anymore. "I'm not staff," she said softly. "Then who are you?" Marcus asked, and his tone made clear that the question was not really a question. It was a dismissal. Before she could answer, another cousin stepped forward and murmured something to Marcus about keeping the mourning from becoming a scene. Marcus straightened his jacket, and in a voice just quiet enough to pretend it was civil, he said, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." And Diane, dignified, grief-stricken, and still wearing her husband's ring, walked out. She sat on the chapel steps in the gray morning air, holding the letter against her chest, and she waited. Because Theodore had told her to wait. He had told her in that letter, in his careful, deliberate handwriting, that she should be there when the will was read. He had told her not to be afraid. She trusted him. She had always trusted him. The chapel emptied slowly after the service. The polished crowd filtered out in dark wool in lowered voices, And Diane was still on the steps when the funeral director gently told her that the family had requested the will reading take place in the chapel before they dispersed. "You should come in," the director said, and something in his expression told her that he knew exactly who she was. She walked back through those doors. The chapel felt different now, smaller, quieter, stripped of its ceremony. Marcus stood near the pulpit with two cousins and a family attorney named Gerald Fitch, who held a sealed document with an expression that Diane would later describe as carefully neutral. She could feel Marcus watching her as she entered. She could feel him trying to figure out who had let her back in and why. Then Father Brennan, the family's longtime priest and a witness to Theodore's final documents, stepped forward and cleared his throat. He began to read. The language of wills is formal and dry, full of whereases and herebys, and for the first 30 seconds, Marcus relaxed. He heard his name attached to the Midtown properties, to a number that made him exhale with satisfaction. He stopped listening as carefully. He let himself feel the morning resolved. And then Father Brennan's voice shifted slightly, not louder but steadier, as if he was reading something that required care. To my wife, he read, Diane Osei Hargrove, whom I married on the 14th of April. To her, I leave the Riverside apartment, the full contents of my personal investment portfolio, and the deed to the Hargrove family estate in Connecticut, along with my sincerest prayer that she uses it to build the life she spent too long believing she didn't deserve. The chapel went completely still. Marcus turned to look at Diane, and for the first time he really looked at her. Not at the dress or the shoes or the assumptions he'd loaded onto her the moment she walked through the door. He looked at her face, the quiet, exhausted grief of it, the gold ring on her left hand that he had somehow not noticed, the letter pressed to her chest, and the understanding that crossed his face was slow and devastating, the way the worst realizations always are. He started. She is Mrs. Hargrove, Gerald Fitch said simply, your father's legal wife of 11 months, witnessed, notarized, and filed with the county clerk. Gerald then reached into his briefcase and placed a second envelope on the pulpit. Theodore had left a letter for Marcus as well. It was 3 pages long. The family attorney had been instructed to give Marcus privacy to read it, but those who were present later said that Marcus stood very still for a long time after he finished, and that when he finally looked up, his eyes were red. Theodore had written about loneliness. He had written about the years of polite distance he had accepted from his son in place of real closeness. He had written about Diane, not defensively, not with apology, but with the unguarded tenderness of a man describing the best thing that had ever happened to him. He had written near the end, I did not hide her from you to hurt you, Marcus. I kept waiting for you to have time for me. She was the one who showed up. Diane did not gloat. She did not look at Marcus with triumph or with resentment. When he finally approached her, standing close enough that she could see how much of his father's face lived in his own, she simply waited. I didn't know, he said. His voice was strange, stripped of its authority, suddenly just a man who had lost his father and was only now beginning to understand what else he'd lost. I know, Diane said. He wanted to tell you. He wanted you to be there. She paused. He talked about you every week. He was always proud of you. That sentence undid Marcus Hargrove in a way that nothing else that morning had. He pressed his hand to his mouth and turned away, and the cousins looked at each other and the chapel returned to silence. Diane walked out into the afternoon light alone. The gray had burned off. The sky was pale and clear. She stood at the top of the chapel steps, the same steps she'd sat on in humiliation just hours before, and she breathed. Theodore Hargrove had seen something in Diane Osei that his own son had overlooked in a single glance. Not because Marcus was monstrous, but because the world had long ago taught men like him which people were worth a second look. Theodore had unlearned that lesson. Slowly, over coffee on Tuesday mornings, over park benches and worn novels, and the patient grace of a woman who had never stopped showing up, he had unlearned it completely. And in the end, the greatest inheritance he left wasn't written in the will at all. It was the reminder that dignity is not something a person earns by being witnessed. It is something they carry quietly, in plain black dresses and worn envelopes, on the steps of chapels that tried to turn them away.